something there. Oh, there we are in the car again. I think that's rather a nice picture. Pity I don't look now like I did then. I shouldn't be looking at that. He had 3 elder brothers. He was the much younger one. And the other brothers were all in the consular service. And his mother died when he was very young, I think maybe 12 years old, or something like that. So each time an elder brother came back on leave, they always sort of complained about him. And he didn't have a particularly easy time as a child, but he did go and spend quite a lot of time with a married sister who he was very fond of, whose father was the vicar at Seymour Church. And I think that started his great interest and affection for churches everywhere. And so he used to spend quite a lot of holidays there. And then he did go to university in London. Eventually went to Uppingham School up in the north or the middle of England. And then as soon as he was able to, he got enough money and went to Canada, because he knew he never would be allowed to work in the theatre in London, which was his one great wish. His mother died when he was young, and I don't know much about his father. I don't know when his father died, but I know that his elder brothers, I only knew one of them, Sir John Pratt, who was a writer, amongst other things, and they all had rather important consular jobs. But I think he had to fend for himself, really, and follow his own wishes, and he just knew he always wanted to be an actor, which was strange in a way for such a retiring man. But anyway, he achieved his goal, which was wonderful. Well, I think it is interesting that, as an actor, as mostly as an out-of-work actor till he was able to get into one play, which played in Los Angeles, and which the talent scout noticed his performance. So they had him go out to Universal to test, and he was thrilled about that and had no idea what it would be for. So he was rather cast down when he found it was to be this monster, but he was only too thrilled to have the job. Bela Lugosi had already turned it down, and I think 1 or 2 other people. But after that, he realized how lucky an actor is to be typecast, because there are 40 good-looking actors for every part. But if you get typed for a certain strange part, then the market is much better for you. That's why when he got to the theatre, he was so happy again to be able to play different types of characters. But all through the Frankenstein years, which I didn't really know him at that time, but always children, always the fan mail, always saw through the character and saw him as a very loving, caring person. And they had compassion always for the monster. Well, I only saw it, just shortly before he died. I had never seen it. So I've only seen it once. I'm not really an expert on it. Oh yes, in Canada. When he first arrived in Canada, he had, I think in those days you probably had to have a job to go to before they would let you. I'm not sure about that. But he got a job on a farm. But when he arrived, the job, I think, wasn't really there. So he had a very rough time logging and doing any job that came really to hand. And eventually burgled his way into some little stock company after a lot of hardships. Well, he told me that when he was on this ship going out to Canada, determined to be an actor, and not then realizing really was no theatre except little stock companies in Canada, he realized that the name Pratt was an unfortunate name for an actor. So he picked Karloff out of the air, which he always said was some name on his mother's side. But, I mean, he never said whether anything to do with Russian ancestry or anything like that. I know no more than that. Other people have dug up different ideas about it. But that's all. That's what he always told me, and that's all I ever accepted.
Yes.
It turned out to be a wonderful name, because at that time he didn't know that he would be portraying parts where the name was so suitable to. Well, he was a very, very modest man, period. I don't know what he felt about, I mean, he just adored acting. It's the one thing he knew he'd always wanted to do. I mean, his family had expected him to go into the diplomatic service, and he knew that was the last thing he had any interest in, which is why he went to Canada, not even knowing there was any theatre there. Well, I don't know about my reaction, but his reaction, when it was over, he turned to me and he said, "It just seems so tame." He said, "I can't believe it changed the whole course of my life." And I suppose it seemed, maybe, obviously it didn't seem very horrifying to me. I'd never been to horror movies anyway. I don't like horror movies. When he first started in the business, of course, there was no actors' union, I don't think, as such. And the hours were just preposterous. And as Frankenstein, I think it took 4 hours to put the makeup on and 5 hours to take it off. And you were given at that time no proper time for rest or anything else. So a whole lot of actors at that time were equally upset and dissatisfied at the conditions. So they formed a group together, and they used to meet secretly, very secretly. They used to leave their cars around the corner where they weren't all seen to be in a group together. And there were about 20 or so of them who had these meetings and then formed what later became the Screen Actors Guild. And Boris was number 9 of that number. There are now, of course, hundreds of thousands, and it was a wonderful start to, of course, what's benefited actors all over the world. He was always very proud of that. And then many years later, when we were living in New York, they gave him his gold card, which was a very proud possession and which I still have.
The thing that I know that you talk about well, and you don't mind talking about, is his, well, there's a great two-way relationship with Boris and children, and this is illustrated perfectly by when he played Peter Pan. So maybe you'd like to tell us something about that period, and how much he enjoyed playing it and how much the children loved him as Captain Hook.
Yes, he really loved doing Peter Pan. He loved both of the parts. He loved all the children in the company. He loved Jean Arthur. He felt so sorry that, because she had a very, very retiring person, she doesn't want to get involved with anything. And during the intermission, Boris used to get a kick out of looking through the curtain, the hole in the curtain, and seeing all the children trying to fly, up and down the aisles and everything. And then an enormous lot of them went back. He always saw all the children that wanted to come. But Jean wouldn't have anybody come back, and he used to tell her how much she was missing, what enormous pleasure she would get from seeing these children. But that didn't appeal to her. But he said it always amused him to see these pretty little girls who would come into the dressing room, and he'd always say to them, "Would you like to try on my hook?" And they would try on the hook and then look in the glass and have these ferocious expressions on their faces and go home very happy.
What about this business about that they could see through the characters he was playing to the real man?
Yes, I think all children really can see through. I mean, they know it. They love to pretend to be frightened. It's all part of the game, and they could. That's why both in Frankenstein and Captain Hook, they loved to be frightened, but they knew that underneath it was really somebody like their father or their grandfather playing a game with them.
And I gather he had great joy in reading fairy tales for records.
Yes, he made an enormous amount of records. You probably know what they all are. I mean, he did a lot of Shakespearean ones. He did Aesop fables. He did Alice in Wonderland. He did all the well-known stories. I mean, he had an enormous record collection. And then, of course, one thing that gave him great joy was the children's radio program that he did for a season in New York, and which won an award. I don't remember what it was called now, but that was very successful and gave him an enormous amount of pleasure. Mm. And they lived in the Dakota, which you probably know is a well-known building in New York. There were a lot of children living in the building at the time, and they didn't know who Boris was at all, but they all loved him. And they all used to, it was a wonderful building because you could run all around the whole building. There were 4 elevators. Alex
Siegel, right. Yeah.
They started doing live television in New York, and Boris did a lot of that. He loved it. He found it very stimulating.
Sorts of things on television, but he seemed to appear with a lot of people in comedy, so he must have enjoyed himself with that. I've got notes of him being with Jack Benny and people like that.
Yes, he loved, of course, Jack Benny is one of the great performers of all time, and he loved working with him. In those days, guest spots, you know, were a great thing. You got to work with everybody and in all kinds of different ways.
Now, we know that he was on This Is Your Life, and you were involved there. How did he take it?
It was really very, very unfortunate because Ralph Edwards is a very old friend, and I knew him before I knew my husband. And we saw a great deal of each other. And Boris said to me one day, "Now, promise me you'll never let me go on This Is Your Life." And I said, I suppose I said yes. Well, we were living in California at that time, and Ralph said to me one day, "You know, I really want to tell you this, and it's true that I've said something to Boris, and I have a feeling," I mean, the subjects never did know, but I don't know quite what it was. But anyway, Ralph said that he had had some conversation at one time with Boris where he felt he would be quite happy to go on. So I agreed, I think wrongly. Boris always said I sold him down the river for a gas cooker and a few other things that went with it. I hope that's not true. But anyway, it's very difficult time trying to keep it secret, living with somebody, and we were living in that time at the Chateau Marmont because we were just temporarily from New York. So I would have to go down in the lobby and take telephone calls and things. And unfortunately, the program had to be put back 2 weeks because somebody on an earlier schedule was ill. So it made it extra difficult. When the evening came for This Is Your Life, my husband was not feeling well, but not ill enough to do anything about. And he had thought we were going to watch the show, and then we were all going out to supper afterwards. So he was sitting at the back of the auditorium, and when Ralph said, "Boris Karloff, This Is Your Life," Boris thought he was being introduced to the audience and took a bow. And of course the look of horror on his face when he found that he was the subject, and I think the look of hatred that he gave me before he stepped on the platform was something. But he was such a professional that he forgot his illness, and you know, it was a very, very good show indeed.
Tonight, This Is Your Life, Boris Karloff. here, Boris. I do mean it. All right, pal, come here. Boris, I think we really put the... Oh, my. This, believe me, is the greatest shocker, I think, of all time. He has been giving shocks all his life.
But he was still smoking heavily all of this time. And after the performance at the party, he really got ill and they had to call a doctor. And at that time, he was told never to smoke another cigarette, which he never did from that moment on. But he asked the doctor if he could smoke a pipe, and the doctor said yes. So he smoked a pipe for several years. And then after that, of course, it got worse, and he got this emphysema. And eventually he he couldn't even have a cigar. But he was very, very strong-minded, and he never let it bother him. He just gave up whatever he was told to and got on with it. But I wished he'd given it up many, many years earlier.
The painting, is it actually with any particular place now, or was it lost?
Oh no, I've given it to...
You've donated it to...
I've given it to the National Portrait Gallery.
That particular one?
Yes, the original.
Yes,
this is the copy which they made and gave to me. And it's so perfect, you know, I wouldn't know it. And it's in the original frame. And this man, Facian, who's a Mexican, is quite well known. And he had a studio in Santa Monica. And Jimmy Cagney, who I don't know whether you know, but he was a very good painter as well. And he was having lessons from Facian, and he told me this, you know, a few years ago, before he died, that he was taking lessons from Facian, and he remembered Boris coming to the studio and sitting for this portrait. They didn't know each other then. In fact, I don't know whether they ever knew each other. And then many, many years later, when I came to America and I saw a photograph of this drawing, which I liked very much, and Boris had really no recollection about it, and he certainly never commissioned it, and he didn't know who did commission it. And by that time, it was in a gallery for sale, and he bought it for our paper anniversary, which is the first anniversary. Well, I think probably the most, well, they were so varied, really, what he did do in the theatre. I think the one, in a way, that he enjoyed the most, perhaps, was doing The Lark, the Henri translation of The Lark, with Julie Harris, who he adored and admired very much, and Christopher Plummer, who was extremely, and a very, very good cast indeed. And he got a lot of satisfaction and pleasure out of working with that. That was just in New York, Go on the Road. On Borrowed Time by Paul Osborne was a lovely play which he very much enjoyed doing. And he played it in many places, I think in the Round in Atlanta, which was one of the first in the Round theatres, which he found very satisfactory and enjoyed. But many actors hate it, I know. And then he played that in Alaska and Hollywood and I think Puerto Rico and different places, but it was always very successful. Well, you see, he had sung before Peter Pan. He sang with Rosemary Clooney, and he sang now and again on different, what you call, shows that were done in those days with celebrities. You had to more or less, you know, come on and turn handsprings or whatever. So that I think he got a big kick out of finding that he really was going to sing. We didn't come back to live in England until 1958. And Boris would have loved to have worked on the stage, but the only scripts that were sent him were only gimmicky ones. The scripts that came were not good plays in their own. It was by using a name helping to bolster the absence of a decent script, and was nothing that interested him. He did not want to do Arsenic and Old Lace in London. He felt he was too old for that and didn't want to try getting in and out of the window seat every night. And then unfortunately no good scripts came along. Yes, cricket was one of his consuming passions, and he was a very active member of the Hollywood Cricket Club. And then later on, when we were living in New York and we used to come back to England in summer, of course he'd spend all the time he could at the Oval and at Lord's, had a wonderful time. And he always said he was so lucky that I didn't want to look at it, because it meant that he could go and sit with all the players. I don't know how much everybody knows about cricket, more than I do, I hope. But they have a practice net where people practice bowling. And the Oval have got a very big scheme on now where they've bought up wasteland around and are developing that for all the young people of the neighbourhood to come in and train for cricket or different games and everything, to give them occupation. And so I have been able to have a net named after Boris, or a 6 practice net. So as soon as this opens next summer, by the Queen I believe, there will be a Boris Karloff net, which will be rather a nice memorial to have. And then another nice thing that I have for him in our local church in the country, some new bells in his name, which I know he would have been very thrilled with. Yes, he did a monthly program for Reader's Digest when we were living in New York and when we were on tour. When we were in New York, then he would go to the studio and do it. But when we were on tour, I would do the engineering, for want of a better word. So we took the machine with us and did it wherever we happened to be, all over the place, from England to Alaska, etc. And then we would do the recording and mail the tapes in, and it seemed to be very successful. Well, he always enjoyed working enormously, and of course he loved working with Vincent and with Christopher and all the other people of that time. When I married Boris, of course I got to know his daughter, who was a very dear little girl, and we have remained good friends ever since. Unfortunately, we live 6,000 miles apart, but we always get to see each other when I go to California. I mean, he was on tour and away and everything. He didn't really see an awful lot of her at all as a little girl.
No.
And then when we were married, she used to come and stay weekends. But, you know, it wasn't really until she was grown up, or till she was married for the first time. She has, funnily enough, terrible taste in men and had 2 disastrous marriages. But I think that sometimes happens. But she's a very, you know, I hardly only see her once a year when I go to California, but, you know, we have always been very close.
What I can also perceive is tremendous courage, because he wasn't well in later years, which goes back to the early period of working like a slave.
Yes. Well, he had, I mean, it developed into very bad arthritis, which was extremely painful, and although he had all the possible treatments, when cortisone first came on the market and we were living in New York, he used to have to go across the park to see the doctor every morning and have cortisone, and he was thrilled. It had the most marvellous effect. He could walk home from the theatre to the Dakota, but unhappily that wore off, and so that wasn't used after a little time. And his particular kind of arthritis is inoperable, so that although he had every possible treatment, it really boiled down to his knee walking bone on bone, which was obviously very painful. But he had great courage. He never complained. If anybody said, "How are you?" he always said, "Never felt better." And of course he loved working, and that is a good adrenaline on its own. And but it was the smoking, really, in earlier life, that he didn't stop in time, from which he died of emphysema.
He owed Roger Corman a few days' work.
That's right. He owed Roger a few days' work, and Roger had great faith in Peter Bogdanovich and was encouraging him all the time. So he offered Peter the days that Boris owed him. So we shot out at this little studio, and it was done on an absolute shoestring. But Boris enjoyed it and liked Peter so much and saw great potentials there, so gave him the extra time, whatever was needed. And I helped however I could out on the sets and various things like that. We worked very long hours, but he enjoyed it and did a marvelous job. And if you ever saw the film, the last speech at the end was done in one take, which was fantastic.
Boris worked with Jack Nicholson, and of course it was only in 2 pretty low-budget Roger Corman
yes,
pictures.
it was, but you know, funnily enough, I don't remember a lot about a lot of these films, but I do remember him coming home that day and saying, there's a boy in this film that's really going to go far. Now, I didn't pay any attention at the time, but it was a very good prophecy. Yes, we always enjoyed going abroad for different shows very much. And one television show that was called I Spy was one that Bill Cosby was in. And we both liked so much, and he was so kind and so considerate to Boris that I'm always delighted when I see that he's top of the charts. Another experience that was very interesting was going to Spain to do Don Quixote in terrible weather, and my husband had an awful time in that. And having got to Spain and got out to the plains, it looked so much like California that everybody had to wait while they sat for large jars to put either side of the road to make it look like Spain. And there was no need to have taken everybody out to Spain anyway. Could have done it right in California. Having been to St. Paul's many times and seen tablets for friends of mine, Boris loved churches in London so much that I thought it'd be wonderful if there could be a tablet there for him. So I asked the vicar, who very kindly agreed to it, and that's what happened. That's how it's there now. And I know he would be very thrilled to think of it. On what would have been his 100th birthday, the Motion Picture Academy in Hollywood very kindly decided to give him a tribute, to which of course I went. And it was a most wonderful occasion. The Academy Theatre was filled, and George Schaefer, well, to start with, Robert Wise, the president of the Academy, who Boris knew well and admired enormously, spoke beautifully for him. Then George Schaefer gave a long and wonderful tribute, and they were very close friends, worked together frequently. Then they showed various clips from films. Then they had people going up on the stage talking about him. Vincent Price, Peter Bogdanovich. Then there were 4 women on the stage, including May Clark, who was the only living member of the original Frankenstein cast. Anna Lee. Yes, well, I am enormously impressed with the number of mostly young people, a lot of whom probably were not born even until after my husband died, who have got this great interest in his work and what he's done, and who look upon him with great warmth as a person. And sometimes they say, oh, I wish he had been my grandfather, or I wish he had been my father. And I had a very interesting experience recently of a 32-year-old woman who has now become a successful artist, she's been writing to me, but she came down to see me from a very long distance away to tell me that some years ago she looked at a picture of my husband And for some reason it inspired her to want to draw and paint, which she has now done, and all her things are on exhibition. And she had nothing to bring me down to show because they were all already being shown. But she's doing a picture for me now, which my husband has inspired, which I shall be very interested to see when it's finished.